She was more than a name on a list. She had a laugh that arrived before her words, the kind that made friends forget the day's small aches. She showed up early to put the sprigs of holly on the table, stayed late to wash the dishes. She loved Christmas because it gave her family a reason to gather. The baking, the jokes, the string of tired paper hats. When she smiled, the room leaned in. Sylvia Ortega Pardo, a sister, a mother, an aunt who did not deserve to become shorthand for horror. She was somebody's daughter. She liked to arrange the candles just so. Please help this channel grow, like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. She kept a tiny notebook of recipes and birthdays. The party at her parents' home, the annual holiday night full of familiarity and noise, should have been another ordinary memory to tuck away. Instead, it became the place a neighbor later would call apocalyptic. We will tell Sylvia's story and the story of the others who were at that home on Christmas Eve. The family, the friends, the neighbors and the man who came to their door wearing a Santa suit and changed the meaning of the holiday forever. Covina is a suburban fold east of Los Angeles. Cul-de-sacs, well-kept lawns, and houses where neighbors greet one another across driveways. In that kind of place, holiday gatherings are nearly ceremonial. Grandparents in the den, cousins chasing each other through hallways, the hum of someone frying tamales in the kitchen. On December 24, 2008, one of those houses, the Ortega family home, was hosting its annual celebration. A familiar pattern repeated year after year. Bruce Jeffrey Pardo was, to some, an ordinary man with a complicated private life. He had worked as an engineer and, later, for a time at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He had married Sylvia Ortega in 2006. By 2008, that marriage was collapsing. Their divorce had been formally finalized just days before the massacre, and reports later described bitter conflict over money, custody, and obligations. Detectives would later say that the divorce and Pardo's feelings about it were central to the case. Neighbors who had known Pardo described him as polite, sometimes odd, someone who volunteered, a face at church, as someone who had once seemed like a man trying to keep the right pieces in place. But behind the small talk and the neighborhood routines, investigators would find a man who had spent months planning something destructive and who, on one cold Christmas Eve, crossed a threshold from grievance to atrocity. Shortly before midnight on Christmas Eve, a man wearing a Santa suit arrived at the Ortega home carrying a large, gift-wrapped box. What followed was a sequence of violence, gunfire, flames, chaos that left 9 people dead and several others injured. The name, Covina Massacre, would etch itself into national headlines. Imagine a doorstep on a winter night. People inside are laughing, plates are being passed, paper hats crinkle when heads move. The front door opens to a man in red, a Santa suit, a wrapped present, the pretense of holiday cheer. An 8-year-old child answers the door. The pretense broke in an instant. According to eyewitness accounts and law enforcement reports, the man drew firearms and opened fire. Panic ripped through the house. Guests scattered like birds. Some fled into yards and neighbors' living rooms. Others fell where they stood. Then, as terrified survivors tried to reconcile the unreal, the assailant sprayed a flammable liquid through the house and ignited it. Within minutes, the house was an inferno. Flames and smoke swallowed familiar corners that had held years of birthdays and dinners. Police would later describe the scene as apocalyptic. Bodies were found, some burned beyond immediate recognition. 3 survivors would later recount scrambled memories of bullets, screaming and running for cover. One child who had answered the door sustained critical injuries but survived. Firefighters and paramedics arrived to a scene of chaos. A burning home, terrified neighbors, and a neighborhood that had lost the boundary between safety and horror in a single night. Those who died that night were not statistics. They were Sylvia, her parents, siblings, nephews, people who gathered for a holiday tradition. Each life had a story. The mother who loved to arrange the holiday table, the teenager who liked music and jokes, the older relatives who kept the family history. The loss rippled outward, leaving a long list of grieving relatives and a community stunned by what the night had taken. When first responders reached the Ortega property, they were met with 2 interlocked emergencies: a mass casualty shooting and a fast-moving residential fire. The initial priority was to save lives and contain the blaze. Next came the grim work of evidence collection and witness interviews. Detectives canvassed the area for surveillance video, knocked on doors for eyewitnesses, and forensically documented the scorched interior, the shell casings, and the path of the fire. In the hours that followed, one thread emerged. Survivors, in the fog of their memories, described a man in a Santa suit. Police quickly developed suspects and persons of interest. The victims were all members of the Ortega family. When investigators dug into family records and interviews, a former relative, Bruce Pardo, who surfaced as a person with motive and potential access. Pardo's divorce from Sylvia had concluded just days earlier, and multiple reporting outlets later said the divorce settlement, spousal support orders, and personal bitterness were factors police considered. Investigators also found artifacts that suggested planning. Rented vehicles, the converted device used to spray accelerant, spare weapons and ammunition discovered in rented cars and at Pardo's home. There were also physical clues of gunshot residue patterns, shell casings, and burn patterns that gave investigators a sense of what happened inside the house and how the fire was started. In the days after the attack, the LA County coroner and law enforcement pieced together identifications of victims using dental records and forensic methods. Many bodies were badly burned, requiring careful scientific work to confirm identities. Off-site, a rental car connected to the suspect was found to contain remnants of a Santa suit partly burned and a booby-trapped array of munitions and incendiary devices, according to reporting at the time. That discovery suggested an escape plan that had been intended to cover his tracks and slow any immediate pursuit. Investigators later found that Pardo had also planned escape routes and had packed supplies in other locations, indicating premeditation rather than a crime of passion in the moment. Bruce Jeffrey Pardo was 45 years old at the time of the massacre. On paper, he had a resume of education and jobs. High school in Sun Valley, studies at California State University Northridge, stints in engineering and technical positions. He had been married to Sylvia in 2006. By 2008, the marriage had ended in divorce. What would later emerge in court records and reporting was a portrait of a man who, neighbors said, kept to himself more and more as things turned difficult. As investigators examined Pardo's life, they found evidence of financial strain and grudges, a bitter divorce, a job loss, and what others described as a man who felt wronged. Prosecutors suggested that Pardo had viewed the divorce settlement and the obligations it required as humiliating. Defense counsel would later argue that Pardo was a troubled man but not a mass murderer. The gulf between public narrative and private motive is where many violent crimes live. The outwardly ordinary can conceal a private unraveling that pushes a person across the line. The plan that Pardo had set into motion did not end neatly in Covina. After the attack, Pardo drove to his brother's home in Sylmar. There he died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound in the early hours of December 25. Investigators found in his vehicle a partially burned Santa suit and evidence that devices in a rented car had been booby-trapped in an attempt, possibly, to injure anyone who tampered with the suit or to cover his trail. He was carrying cash and planned travel routes, and emergency responders later reported that Pardo had sustained severe burns from the explosion and fire at the Ortega home. Authorities also reported finding drug metabolites in his system during autopsy, details that would later be reported in the media. The fragments of the plan, the rented vehicles, the cache of weapons, and the incendiary device that turned a family party into a burning house painted a picture of premeditation. The items discovered at Pardo's home suggested months of preparation and a mindset organized around one night. For investigators and prosecutors, premeditation was the through line that turned a tragic domestic dispute into a mass murder investigation with clear criminal intent. The 9 people who died that night were family members and loved ones. They were parents and siblings and a teenage nephew. Reporting from multiple outlets listed the victims and captured the shock of a community that had lost an entire household's memory chest in a single night. Their names were Sylvia Ortega Pardo, 43, the ex-wife, a woman who arranged family holidays and was at the center of the party that night, Joseph S. Ortega, in his late 70s, a father and grandfather who had hosted generations of family gatherings, Alicia Ortega, 70, a matriarch who had kept the family traditions alive, Charles Ortega, 50, a brother-in-law who was part of the family fabric, Sherry Lynn Ortega, 45, a sister-in-law remembered in photographs and by friends, James Ortega, 52, family member and guest, Teresa Ortega, 52, part of the family's everyday life, Alicia Ortega Ortiz, 46, another close relative, Michael Andre Ortiz, 17, a nephew, a teenager whose life and future vanished on a night meant for celebration. Each of those names echoes in the years since in the quiet of a now empty spot at a holiday table, in photos kept in shoeboxes, in memories repeated at vigils. When we tell this story, we must keep those lives fixed in our minds as people, not as mere footnotes in a criminal file. In the hours after the killings, Law enforcement investigators concluded that Bruce Pardo was responsible for the shootings and the arson at the Ortega home, and that he died by suicide at his brother's home in Sylmar early on December 25. They reported that he had used multiple 9mm handguns during the attack, that he had prepared incendiary methods to set the home on fire, and that he had planned aspects of an escape that ultimately failed when flames and panic overtook the scene. The coroner's report and police statements documented both the cause of death for the victims and for Pardo, and the investigations produced a large body of evidence later cited in news reports and public records. Pardo's actions, and his death, meant there would be no criminal trial to examine motive or evidence in open court. Instead, public understanding of the massacre came through law enforcement release of facts, reporting from journalists who sifted through court filings and interviews, and the coroner's determinations. For families, the absence of a trial sometimes meant fewer opportunities to cross-examine, fewer formal moments where motives could be explained in public testimony. That left some questions, particularly about why he chose that night and that house, to be answered by the fragments of investigative findings and the memories of survival. For survivors and families, that partial explanation is of little comfort. For investigators and the public, it leaves a cautionary question. How might communities better notice and intervene when someone is fraying toward violent ends? The image of a man in a Santa suit at a front door is a shock because it transposes the sacred icon of generosity into a symbol of harm. The Covina massacre rewired an image of the holidays into a memory for many families, a reminder that evil sometimes arrives in ordinary clothes, and that ordinary lives can end in extraordinary violence. But if the story has a moral, it is not one of fear. It is a reminder to hold our people close, to pay attention when grief becomes bitterness, and to treat each other's small signs with care. It is a reminder to remember the victims as people who loved and were loved, not as headlines. Sylvia and the others who died that night were hands that measured flour into bowls, jokes told at the table, faces in photographs held by sobbing relatives. We owe them that dignity. If you walk through a quiet street in December and see a string of lights, consider what those lights mean. Think of the families who still set a place at the table and whose memories are stitched into every holiday meal. Remember the names. Remember the stories. Remember that the truest counter to violence is the small, stubborn work of community noticing, listening, and caring for one another before a grievance can turn into a tragedy.